Hey guys, how are you doing? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video, I'm going to talk about a shocking case where a woman welcomed her nephew into her home and had a cruel fate. So, without any more delay, let's get into the video. On August 5, 2015, Marco Antonio Oliveira, aged 49, went to the apartment of his sister, Kelly Cristina Oliveira, aged 44. Kelly's apartment was in the city of São Paulo, Brazil. Kelly was a teacher and lived with her nephew. In the last 2 months, Marco tried to contact his sister, but without success. He called, sent messages and everything, but she didn't return. She also didn't go to visit him, something she used to do quite often. Given all of this, Marco Antonio found it all very strange, because his sister wasn't like that, and they weren't fighting, which would be a reason for her not to answer his calls and also not to go to his house. And that's why, because he thought there was something wrong, he decided to go to her apartment to better check what was happening. Upon arriving at the building, instead of Kelly authorizing Marco to go up to the apartment as he did every time he went there, it was his son who lived with Kelly who went down to the lobby to assist him. This son of Marco in question is Guilherme Lozano Oliveira, who was 22 years old at the time of the events. Guilherme allegedly prevented his father from going up to the apartment, claiming that Kelly didn't want to talk to him. Marco, confused, asked his son why, but Guilherme disagreed, and the man saw that his son's attitude was very suspicious. Marco then said he would go up anyway and managed to disperse his son. When he arrived at the floor where the apartment was located, the door to the property was locked. Marco knew that his son would not want to open it for him and decided to break down the door to gain access to the interior of the place. Once inside the apartment, Marco noticed that Kelly was nowhere to be found, and the place was a mess. The only room in the apartment that Marco was unable to enter was Guilherme's room, as the door was locked. Marco would also break down this door, just like he did with the main door of the apartment, but before he did that, Guilherme appeared in the apartment. Marco questioned his son about where Kelly was and why his bedroom door was locked. At that moment, Guilherme said nothing and simply ran away. Marco went after his son, but because he was younger and faster, Guilherme managed to distance himself from his father, quickly reaching the building's parking lot. In the parking lot, Guilherme got into a car that belonged to his aunt and sped out of the building. Marco arrived at the parking lot a few seconds later and saw Guilherme already on the street, fleeing at high speed in the car. At that same time, a police car was passing on the street next to the building, and Marco went to them to ask for help, reporting everything that had happened. From there, a chase began that lasted a short time, as approximately 0.21 miles from the building, Guilherme crashed his vehicle into a pole. The police officers took advantage and parked their patrol car against the back of his car so that he could not reverse to try to escape. The police then took Guilherme out of the car and arrested him. Meanwhile, another police team arrived at the scene in the apartment. This team would have been requested by Marco over the phone a few minutes earlier. The police officers, together with Marco, went up to the apartment and broke down Guilherme's bedroom door, and what they saw was disturbing. Inside the room there was a refrigerator, and inside that refrigerator several bags and a suitcase were found that contained Kelly's remains. Kelly had been cut into several pieces that were already in an advanced state of decomposition, and were no worse off because they had been somewhat preserved in the refrigerator. The woman's hands, arms, and head were missing. At first, as soon as he was arrested, Guilherme told the police that he had done nothing wrong, but when he was taken to the police station and placed in the presence of his father, he decided to confess to the crime. Now, before we continue, I'm going to talk a little about Guilherme so we have a better context of the case. Guilherme is the son of Marco, as I already mentioned, and Ana Paula Lozano. He has 5 brothers, and according to sources, during his adolescence, he became increasingly rebellious. He was even nicknamed by his closest friends as 13. a nickname given in Brazil generally to crazy people. While still in his teens, Guilherme started hanging out with a group of punks. He hung out with this group and called himself Punk for a few years, but then he simply decided to leave the group. According to himself, he decided to leave the group because the punks didn't have the same ideology as him, so he started hanging out with another group, the skinheads. Skinhead is a subculture that originated among young factory workers in the United Kingdom in the late 1960s, and within a few years spread throughout the world. Initially, these groups were not involved in politics or issues related to it. It was only in the late 70s that there was a division between them, and from one of these divisions, a more radical group emerged. According to sources, this subculture arrived in Brazil in the late 70s and became stronger in the following decade. Currently, there are several groups of skinheads here. Some members just get together to drink and talk. Other members do social work such as donating food baskets, and others get together to beat up people they don't like. Now guess which of these groups Guilherme chose to be part of? Well, he joined a group of skinheads known as Hooligan Impact, whose members are known for following Mr. Mustache ideology. No, it's not that guy, but it looks like him. You know who I'm talking about, right? The members of this group, in addition to being involved in several episodes of violence, were also declared enemies of the punks, and whenever they met, they clashed. As Guilherme had already been part of a group of punks, if he really wanted to join Hooligan Impact, he would first have to pass a startup mission to prove his loyalty to this new group. This startup mission consisted of Guilherme killing some punk. It didn't matter who it was, as long as it was a punk. So on September 3rd, 2011, Guilherme went to a punk band show that was taking place in a bar. Once inside that bar, Guilherme started looking for a boy called Johnny Galanciak, who was 25 years old at the time. Johnny was a friend of Guilherme when he was part of the punks, and was also one of the group's leaders. According to some people who were in that same bar, as soon as Guilherme found Johnny, he went up to him and without saying a single word, he struck the boy 10 times with a sharp object. Even though he was very injured, Johnny managed to run away and was later rescued by one of his friends. Before losing consciousness, Johnny would have told this friend who caused those injuries. While Johnny was being rescued, Guilherme had already fled and was already far away from the scene. Johnny was taken to the hospital while he was still alive, but as his injuries were very serious, he couldn't resist and passed away. Shortly afterwards, the police managed to locate Guilherme and arrest him. At the time, he was 18 years old and spent 8 months in jail for this crime. But as he was a first-time offender, had a fixed home and a job with a formal contract, the court ruled that he could await his trial in freedom, and then he paid bail and was released. Marco, Guilherme's father, even told the court that he would keep an eye on his son to prevent him from getting into other troubles. Oh, it's worth noting here that Guilherme always claimed he was innocent in Johnny's case. According to him, he was mistaken for the true perpetrator of the crime. And even though he was present at the crime scene on the same day it occurred, he had no participation in the case. In November 2015, Guilherme went on trial. In this trial, more than 20 witnesses were heard, and all of them claimed to have seen Guilherme attacking Johnny. As a result, Guilherme was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, the court granted him the right to appeal his sentence in freedom, since at the time he had obtained a permanent job and had stopped hanging out with the Hooligan Impact people. After all these events, Guilherme's family kind of moved away from him, but his aunt Kelly, who had a certain affection for him, decided to take him in, and the two started to share an apartment. About 6 months before the crime against Kelly, the two moved into a new apartment. According to neighbors, coexistence between the two was troubled, as it was possible to hear arguments between them almost daily. Guilherme himself told the police that it was during one of these arguments that he lost his temper. In his statement, Guilherme said that in mid-July 2015, 2 months before Kelly's body was discovered, he and his aunt were fighting over the mess his dog had made in the apartment. He would have gone to prepare some coffee to drink, and Kelly continued mumbling, banging on furniture and doors, shouting at him, and then he attacked him and slapped him in the face. He, with the intention of restraining her, applied a jiu-jitsu move known as an arm lock, which caused her to faint. He said he thought she had just passed out, so he left her on the ground and went out for a walk with his dog to cool down a bit. When he returned to the apartment, he was surprised that his aunt was still on the floor, and when he approached her, he realized that she was no longer alive. He thought about calling an ambulance or calling the police, but as he was free for another crime, he was scared. Guilherme said he knew that the police would not believe that it was just an accident, and this time he would be arrested and would no longer be able to see his daughter, who at the time was only 2 years old, the result of a relationship with an ex-girlfriend. It was then that he decided he would get rid of the body little by little. According to Guilherme, to gain courage, he consumed an entire bottle of whiskey, and under the influence of alcohol, he cut his aunt into several pieces. After that, he removed the shelves from the refrigerator, dragged it to his room, and then put his aunt's pieces in the refrigerator. Guilherme's plan was to take the pieces little by little to a family farm, where he would discard them. He said that was where his aunt's head, arms, and hands were, and that he decided to take those parts first, as they were easier to carry. To provide additional information, prior to Guilherme disclosing the location of the missing parts of his aunt to the police, which were not found in his room, certain individuals who were following the case speculated that Guilherme had cooked these parts of his own aunt and fed them to his dog as food, a theory that was later proven to be unfounded. Well, I know it is not very relevant information, but I am just putting it here to compliment. Guilherme also stated in his testimony that his Aunt Kelly had mental problems such as bipolar disorder, which caused her to change her mood drastically and frequently, and because of this, their coexistence was no longer so good. According to the investigators involved in the case, throughout his testimony, Guilherme appeared cold. Investigators said he was calculating and didn't mind keeping his aunt's body for 2 months in a refrigerator in his room. Guilherme didn't care about that at all, and went on with his life as if nothing had happened, and even tried to deceive his own father so that he wouldn't discover the truth. At the time of the crime, Guilherme practiced jiu-jitsu and boxing, in addition to being 190 meters tall and weighing 254 pounds. His size and strength were quite disproportionate to his aunt's, making it clear that if he really just wanted to immobilize her, he would have succeeded without much effort, but that's not what he did. It was also noted by investigators that although Guilherme stated that he no longer had contact with hooligan impact people, he still wore some of the group's symbols in his car, indicating that he was possibly in contact with them. Still in 2015, Guilherme gave an interview to a TV program in which he stated that he felt like rubbish for having been responsible for what happened to his aunt. In that same interview, he also stated that what happened to his aunt was an accident and that he was innocent in the Johnny's case. On April 23, 2019, the trial of Guilherme Lozano began in São Paulo. Guilherme, who was 27 years old at the time, was on the popular jury. During his trial, several people were heard, including Marco, the defendant's father, who stated that after his son was released in 2011 to be released, he spent 3 years without having much contact with him, and that he was unaware of his involvement with hooligan impact. Ana Paula, Guilherme's mother, stated that although her son was a bit rebellious, she did not believe that he would be capable of taking someone's life, and even believed him when he told her that he was innocent in the case of Johnny. Guilherme's defense tried to revert the charge from an intentional crime, which is when one has the intention to kill, to a culpable crime, which is when one does not intend to commit it. They defended the idea of bodily injury followed by death, which would be less serious than the accusation Guilherme was responding to. However, despite these arguments from the defense, Guilherme was found guilty of triple homicide, a base motive, a resource that made the victim's defense impossible and somewhat cruel. As a result, Guilherme received a total sentence of 20 years for the crime against his Aunt Kelly, and another 15 years for the crime against Johnny. Shortly after the end of the trial, Guilherme's defense tried to annul his conviction, while the prosecution filed a request to increase his sentence. In February 2020, the 15th Criminal Law Chamber of the Court of Justice denied both Guilherme's defense request and the prosecutor's request. Currently, Guilherme Lozano Oliveira is incarcerated in a prison in the state of São Paulo, where he will serve his sentence. Good folks, so that's it. Thank you very much for watching me up to this point, and I'll see you in the next video.